Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Gertz. I'm the Director of Communications for the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. If you're not familiar with us, DOSI, the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, or DOSI, is a global network of deep ocean experts who work to connect deep ocean science to policy, making sure decision makers have the information they need to effectively manage and conserve deep ocean ecosystems. This session today for the DOOS annual meeting is titled Connecting Deep Ocean Science and Policy, the Future of the BBNJ Treaty. As a little bit of background before we get started, in 2023, the United Nations adopted a treaty commonly referred to as BBNJ, standing for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. And once that is ratified, the treaty will be a legally binding instrument for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. That includes the international ocean and the seabed, including the deep sea. Key themes of the treaty include setting international standards for managing marine genetic resources, marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and both capacity building and transfer of marine technology. And because of that, accomplishing the treaty's ambitious goals will critically depend on deep ocean science and observing and expert knowledge. So the reason for this session today is to talk about the implications of the new BBNJ treaty for deep ocean science and observing and where we can go from here. We'll be starting with 3 expert presentations. First, we're going to hear from Christina M. Jerde, JD, on the basics of the new BBNJ treaty and what it does. Then Professor Marcel Jaspers is going to talk about marine genetic resources. And Professor Jeffrey J. Marlowe will finish this off with his experience working to connect deep ocean science and policy. So our first presentation is from Christina, who I see is here. And I'm going to go ahead and share Christina's slides so that she can get started with her presentation.
Okay, well, I can say hello and thank you for joining us already. That was at the end of a very long day. I think I saw some of you this morning in the Deep Ocean in Africa session, so I'm pleased that you made it up this late at night to listen to what is going on with the Marine Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement. As you see, I wear many hats with IUCN, Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, as well as a adjunct professor of international ocean law. I'll be wearing my professorial hat here if you don't mind me, so please feel free to ask any questions after the presentations today. That was the next slide. Because I know you're not supposed to put an acronym on the screen, I thought I would provide you with the full text, the full name of the agreement in the next slide. And 2 things to take away here, which is it's an agreement under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on the conservation, sustainable use of marine biological diversity, the diversity, abundance, and distribution of marine life of areas beyond national jurisdiction. The important point here is that it's under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, so it needs to be interpreted and applied consistent with the rights, duties, and obligations under this so-called framework agreement, the Convention on the Law of the Sea. The Law of the Sea Convention was drafted in the 1970s, finalized in 1982. It has some fundamental obligations on all states to protect and preserve the marine environment, as well as to conserve living marine resources of areas beyond national jurisdiction. But there are no institutions, there's no real procedures or obligations or standards that are developed by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea or any institution that is specifically charged with marine biological diversity. And hence this gave rise to a need for some form of international agreement to foster cooperation. And the BBNJ, areas beyond national jurisdiction, we'll see in the next slide. The high seas are those areas beyond the territorial sea, 12 nautical miles from the coast, and then the exclusive economic zone, which is generally out to 200 nautical miles from the shoreline, and that's the areas in the dark blue. What's important to note is that it leaves most of the ocean subject to lack of regulation or regulation that requires international cooperation and collaboration to get anything done. You can do a lot within your domestic environment out to 200 nautical miles. And if you look vertically, that is basically 95% of the livable habitat for life on this planet. Different regime for the deep seabed area, as we'll see in the next slide. So the ocean is divided vertically and horizontally, and the seabed area is denoted as the common heritage of humankind, but it's only seabed mineral resources that are actually regulated under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And under an interesting regime that says activities related to seabed mineral resources shall be carried out for the benefit of humankind as a whole. What this left unregulated was something that they didn't really bother with back in 1970s, which were living marine resources of the deep seabed or even the ocean water column. That was many of our lawyers, probably myself included, persisted in this view of the Azoic ocean, that there was no life the deeper you went. And hence much of our perceptions and our international regulations have been designed for a basically dead ocean. So now we have to figure out how to bring the ocean to life. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is pause for a celebration and then go a little bit more deeper into the details of what it actually provides, the BBNJ agreement, and then talk briefly about next steps, and hopefully we'll get into further discussions on what this means for ocean science and ocean observation. So celebration. Next slide. So here, I'd like to celebrate people like Maria Baker and Paul Snellgrove and those who were involved in the Census of Marine Life. As you'll see up in the upper right-hand corner, this was a 10-year international collaborative venture that basically put the high seas and the deep sea on the map. Before this cooperative venture started, there were few technologies to actually tag and track highly migratory species like tuna when they swam from San Francisco to Tokyo and maybe coming back, or able to visualize the richness of deep seabed resources, something beyond just the minerals, but in fact you had rich life at hydrothermal vents on seamounts, cold water corals, and it was this awareness that cold water corals and seamounts were being trammeled by deep sea bottom trawling that actually got the attention of delegates at the United Nations to saying, shouldn't we have regulations to actually control activities to assess their impacts in areas beyond national jurisdiction? So this gave way to the next slide, which is the long and winding road towards the culminating date of 2023, from the time when my hair was blonde, when we first started talking about the need for marine biodiversity protection of the deep seabed, to actually embracing all of the ocean water column beyond national jurisdiction, taking it to all the international meetings that we could with scientific partners, always close at hand. DOSI was established in 2013, but I've been working with scientists from the Census of Marine Life and others from way before that time, like Lisa Levin and Alba Escobar. So it's been an exciting journey and certainly not one that the lawyers could do alone. Next slide, please. So again, another reason for celebration is not only do we have the agreement adopted, but it has been signed by 90 states, signifying their intent to go the next step of ratification, which is their embracement of the legal rules and procedures to fully implement the treaty domestically. And already 5 have ratified from disparate parts of the globe. This includes Palau, Chile, the Seychelles, Belize, and Monaco. And the European Union has already committed to fast-tracking implementation through both the member states and the European Commission. And France is trying to be the first out the pike. And the goal is to have this treaty ratified by at least 60 states and enter into force by June 2025, when we hope to see you all at the UN Ocean Conference in Nice. Next slide, please. So what does it actually do? I love this sort of illustration of the hydrozoa because it sort of emblemizes sort of the idea of the framework and the enabling conditions for life to thrive. As the next slide shows, that was the BBNJ agreement is filled with the four components that you've been hearing about: marine genetic resources, area-based management tools, environmental impact assessments, capacity building. But overarching all of this are the general provisions. Next slide, please. Which really provide a tool to align the objectives of states, both when they're operating within the BBNJ agreement itself, but also when they operate in other international agreements and bodies. And you'll hear this term, maybe IFBs, international frameworks, bodies, and instruments. But it means that there are organizations, RFMOs, regional fisheries management organizations that manage fisheries on a regional basis, International Maritime Organization for international shipping, and the International Seabed Authority for seabed mining, and some other organizations that are out there. But the value and innovative element of the BBNJ agreement is it actually aligns through obligations and general principles and approaches that we'll see in the next slide. And what's exciting, I think, for all of us, but I think for scientists in particular, is that there are direct obligations, not only to cooperate directly and promote the objectives in these other bodies, as I said, and also the caveat, you can't undermine, you can't run roughshod over what another international body should be doing, which is regulating fishing and shipping, but you can complement them and you can bring them together through collaboration, and you can provide the scientific underpinnings to make sure that decisions are evidence-based, based on the best available science, or precaution when there's great deals of uncertainty. And this obligation to promote international cooperation in marine scientific research and development and transfer of marine technology pervades all of the various provisions of the BBNJ agreement. The next slide or button goes through the general principles and approach. I'm sure many of you have heard about precaution, or the precautionary approach, or the precautionary principle, which is sort of, when in doubt, take measures to prevent harm to the marine environment. That was, or there are various ways to interpret it, that was, but precaution means avoid serious, irreversible, or widespread harm, or you can even backtrack and say when there's uncertainty, you should be taking measures to reduce harm. Ecosystem-based, you know what that means. Climate resilience is a fundamental principle. A new principle, our approach of the BBNJ agreement is we're supposed to be taking actions in all of our capacities to foster resilience to climate change, including maintaining ecosystem services, functions, and carbon cycles. The use of the best available science and scientific information is a foundation upon which the treaty is built, as well as the foundation upon which it will be implemented. Because you need this, and you need all states to have access to that if we're going to fulfill the other principles and approaches of equity, fair and equitable sharing of the benefits, the common heritage of mankind, how do we all benefit, as well as the freedom of marine scientific research. Next slide. We'll speed it up from here. Marine genetic resources are a fascinating issue that I'm so glad that Marcel Jaspers from the DOSI Marine Genetic Resources Working Group is here. He also was great advice to IUCN. But the objectives are really important to note, that it's about fair and equitable benefit sharing, it's about lifting scientific knowledge, it's about supporting innovation and technology. As extensive non-monetary benefits. The monetary benefits will be worked out in greater detail as the time goes on. And we'll let Marcel deal with that. The next slide is area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. I was happy to hear about the various working groups working on sort of habitat mapping in order to start laying out ecologically representative as well as well-connected marine protected areas. We are deeply in need of that sort of knowledge throughout the water column to make sure we have the horizontal as well as the vertical connectivities. But we also need individual sites to be protected in order to preserve, restore, and maintain their own biodiversity, as well as to strengthen resilience to stressors. And science has to underpin the selection as well as the justification of those particular areas. You won't be left alone, because the process for an ABMT proposal actually requires consultations with multiple stakeholders, including the scientific community. And this will be an incredible opportunity to share your information about specific sites, or to say, we really don't know enough, we need further research and collaboration. Well, don't say that, but say, we know enough to know it needs to be protected, but we also need more research, because each marine protected area will have a research and management plan to go along with it. We'll skip to the next slide here. Environmental impact assessments are a common tool used in domestic circumstances, national waters. What's new here is that there's a provision for screening of, okay, we're proposing a new activity. If we really don't understand anything about it or where it's going to occur, then we better start looking at the potential environmental impacts. Because if an activity is likely to cause or may cause significant and harmful changes, it requires a full assessment of baseline information, what the impacts will be, what measures can be taken to avoid harm. Through this process, it will be open, transparent, seeking information from scientists and others to get their view. And there is a scientific and technical body that's been formed by the agreement that will also be providing input into this process. The reason these consultations are so important is that your input can help to determine what really means significant adverse impacts in the context of a particular novel activity. Because states are not supposed to be taking decisions to approve a new activity unless they consider that it can be conducted consistent with prevention of significant adverse impacts. And of course, your data from monitoring assessment will be feeding into the review and reporting processes, so we can actually adapt and evolve these activities. The next slide talks about a new tool developed by the BBNJ agreement regarding strategic environmental assessments, which is, I think, a real advance, because it provides the gathering of scientific information, stakeholder information, and collaboration to identify current potential impacts, data gaps, research priorities, and the development of strategic planning opportunities, both for area-based management tools, as well as informing future environmental impact assessments, or even the conduct of ongoing activities if you see that they are no longer sustainable. Next slide. And then the fifth key component of these four major elements is, of course, capacity building and transfer of marine technology. But I would say capacity building and transfer of marine technology are core elements in all the other environmental impact assessments, area-based management tools. And the thing to note is we're tried to learn from prior experiences where countries were dictated what capacities they needed. Instead, there is a process going on right now for needs assessments to actually identify what sort of human resources, institutional resources, scientific resources would be most suitable for your particular country or region. So please stay tuned for those, and it'll be an exciting opportunity to weigh in. And then finally, is another exciting thing about the BBNJ agreement is it actually creates the institutions to keep the mechanisms running, to make sure that parties are enthusiastic because they can adopt decisions, they can adopt measures, that it's informed by a scientific and technical body. There are finance committees, implementation compliance committees for each of the core elements of the BBNJ agreement. There is a committee that is going to make sure that states are fulfilling their obligations, or if they're not, what are the problems? How do we actually assist in a facilitative way? And then next, and finally, I will say that we are now in the stage of being able to fast track implementation. The three components of bringing the agreement into force, building up institutional mechanisms are already underway. There's a great groundswell of support from the European Union, from the Global Environment Facility, from philanthropies in the US and abroad to really help countries go through the ratification process. So if you know your country needs support, feel free to reach out, especially to IUCN or High Seas Alliance. But there's also going to be the first preparatory commission meeting in June of this year, where they're going to talk about what sort of rules and procedures do we need to give life to these various committees and mechanisms by the time the BBNJ agreement comes into force, hopefully in June of 2025. And then underpinning all this is really mechanisms like the strategic environmental assessments, like your research cruises, like the development of marine genetic resources for research like an environmental DNA, developing the capacity, science, and technology to really keep the mechanisms rolling so that we can have science-based, indigenous knowledge-based, informed, and precautionary management of our shared areas beyond national jurisdiction. With that, I'll turn it over to the rest of you. Thank you very much for your attention. The last slide has my email address and the cockpit of the Falcor, which I hope you will all soon have a chance to see for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, for that overview. I'm reminded that I dramatically failed to introduce Christina properly when starting the presentation, but I should also say that Christina is not only on DOSI's steering committee, but is also Senior High Seas Advisor to IUCN's Global Marine and Polar Program. Thanks very much, Christina. Next up, Marcel Jaspars is going to speak on marine genetic resources. And Professor Jaspars is professor at the University of Aberdeen and co-leads DOSI's Marine Genetic Resources Working Group. Marcel is also joining us from a quite late time zone. So thank you very much for making the time for this. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Good. Okay, I'll just try and face the screen whilst I'm talking. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for coming. This part of the treaty may not necessarily appear immediately relevant to the deep ocean observation strategy, but I'll tell you that it does in a minute. It'll become quite apparent why it is important part of the treaty. But this is the most contentious part of the treaty during the negotiations, and it was also one of the most technically difficult for a lot of the delegates. The basic principle behind it is this idea of marine biodiscovery and marine bioprospecting, that there is value in the deep sea resources in terms of developing products and processes. And that comes from the idea of sampling in the deep sea, for instance, and getting a bioresource. It could be a sediment sample from which you grow a bacterium, such as these beautiful bacteria over here, or it might be a sponge that you collect in the deep. And from that, you can either get chemistry directly, so you extract the chemicals from these organisms or their the microorganisms, or you extract the DNA and use that to develop a product. Now, first of all, you do some kind of testing or some kind of screening. It could be a test for cancer. It could be a test for an optimized enzyme to work at low temperatures, for instance. And then over a period of years, you might develop a product. And there's a number of products on the market yet, of which perhaps only a few have actually been derived from areas beyond national jurisdiction to date. So just to introduce the topic, and as Christina was saying, there's a lot of preamble to and definitions to the agreement. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll provide the slides to you afterwards. But suffice it to say that a lot of these definitions, a lot of this preamble is really important in terms of setting the scene for what it is that we're discussing. And again, the most important one is that this term, marine genetic resources, which is meaningless essentially to scientists, is something that is very much similar to another agreement, another treaty called the Nagoya Protocol, which is under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is to share benefits from terrestrial organisms. And the fact that these two treaties are using a similar language is really, really important, so that nobody goes shopping between the two different areas. So you cannot say, you know, there's no agreement for this part of the world, but there now is. And again, it defines terms like biotechnology. It defines utilization there. And then the important part, as Christine already mentioned, is this fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from activities with respect to marine genetic resources. And this extra term, digital sequence information, essentially means DNA information, although it hasn't been properly defined either here or in the Convention on Biological Diversity. So I think the important part of the treaty, as well as this building and development of the capacity of the parties, again with respect to marine genetic resources and DSI in this case. Again, it's broader than that, but specifically for marine genetic resources, it mentions it again and links it to Part 5 of the treaty on capacity building and transfer of marine technology. And then this idea of working together in all activities with respect to marine genetic resources and digital sequence information of areas beyond national jurisdiction. Again, this cooperation is throughout the treaty is, again, a really essential part of it. And it shall be carried out exclusively for peaceful purposes. Again, this is an important part of the treaty. So what is expected? So this is Article 12. And Article 12 is the one that is probably scientifically the most important for people doing observation and mounting research expeditions and cruises. And the idea is that there is a obligation on anybody mounting a cruise to put out a pre-cruise notification, and that will contain a range of information such as the objectives of the cruise, subject matter of the research, geographical areas to be entered, methods to be used, etc. There's a list of them, which I'll go through in a minute. And then this entity called the clearinghouse mechanism will provide you with a BBNJ standardized batch identifier, which will then be assigned to you. And that number follows every sample from the cruise. That's the important part. So every time you do something beyond that part, that number will pursue it. It will follow it along like a tag, just saying this came from BBNJ, this came from this particular cruise. It doesn't necessarily have to be the exact location or the exact sample name in each case. It just has to be tagged with that sample. So what happens then is that if you mount your cruise and you're about to mobilize, what you find is that something has changed, and there's enough time, you notify the clearinghouse that there's a change to your planning or your area you will enter or the equipment you will use. You just notify the clearinghouse mechanism. And the idea then is that there is this period between the notification and the actual cruise itself. There's time for people to join the cruise or say, actually, you know, there's 15 spare berths on the cruise. We could accommodate a number of scientists from other countries on this cruise. And again, this idea of cooperation, coordination is there throughout the treaty. Once the cruise has happened, you would have this post-cruise notification after 12 months, where you say, where are the data stored, where are the samples stored? That's one of the important parts. And then later on, you will have to report to the Benefit Sharing Committee on what has happened in terms of a report on access to materials that have been used and derived from that particular cruise. And that might be done simply by having that tag scanned through databases and scanned through literature articles that have this tag with it. So the BBNJ standardized batch identifier might then be linked back to the cruise that it came from. And that might be used later on to be able to calculate the level of benefits that should be shared. In terms of utilization, that's the one that's the most of interest really to people doing this kind of work. It's where are the results? Are the details of the collection posted somewhere? Sorry, is there other details from the collection after that? I'm not, sorry, I'm not being very coherent at the moment. And then finally, where are the materials to be found, collections, and where can you find things like sales information? The obligation then is that these records and samples can be identified arising from BBNJ. So if you have any materials that come from the deep sea, you should be able to identify that they came from that particular research cruise, but not the exact location. So here's an example of what really happens. This is the one where we found that it was taken from a French research cruise in 1987, just outside of the areas beyond national jurisdiction. And the point is just to say that research, the linear type of process I showed you a minute ago, is not really true. So the kind of stuff that happens, this cruise was in 1987. They took a polychaete worm from which they derived a bacterial strain, which was labeled with the original cruise number. So HYD 657 was the hydronaut cruise from France, from Ifremer. And that then, DNA sequence was derived from that. They derived a chemical product from it. That chemical product was patented because it might be useful in cosmetics. At the same time, the strain was deposited under the Budapest Treaty in Paris. The biological activity was derived in 2012, the chemical structure in 2012 for the structure, 2002 for the activity, and eventually the material was sold as Abyssine by Lanotech, which is associated with Ifremer, to Lucas Meyers, and they merged with Unipec. So it gets really complicated. So none of this is straightforward or linear or easy, But the good thing was that just doing the research online was enabled me to take that cruise identifier and seek it through the literature, the patents, the patent deposits, etc. was always there, that number. So that number is essentially a very crude version of what the BBNJ standardized batch identifier will do, but it does work, but it's just not as simple and as linear and straightforward as they might imagine. So what's required in your BBNJ notification is very similar to what you might already be doing as part of good cruise planning. And it might, for instance, be the objectives, the subject matter of the cruise, the geographical areas into which the collection is to be undertaken, summary of the methods, information concerning any contributions to proposed major programs. And again, a lot of this information is already available as part of a cruise plan, but centralizing this information will really make it easier to cooperate between different researchers globally. The other part of the stuff of the Article 12.2 that needs to be notified, expected date of mobilization, demobilization, the name of the sponsoring institution. This is probably legally the most controversial as to who is actually in charge. Opportunity for scientists of all states, in particular scientists from developing states, to be involved and associated with the project. And again, this is something that's really positive in terms of the treaty itself. And the extent that may need and request technical assistance, again, this is, again, capacity development part, so linking directly to Section 5 of the treaty. The last part is the data management plan, which again is pretty standard in most research. So the one that might be more of relevance to deep ocean observation is this idea of autonomous underwater vehicles and seafloor installations present unique challenges for the treaty. And we've been thinking about this, and particularly with Fran Humphreys in Australia. And again, the idea is that there's this notification, and it gives you this standardized batch identifier, and your AUV is deployed, or your float is deployed, and it may well be sampling materials on the sea floor, and then extracting DNA and sequencing it, and just floating to the surface, and then giving that information to a satellite, which then uploads and downloads that data into a database. So now there's not been a physical sample anymore that's been collected. It's been essentially sampled and destroyed in the AUV on the seafloor or wherever it is. And then technically and legally, it becomes quite difficult to see what happens next. So again, it should be fairly straightforward in terms of this linear process here, but there might be legal challenges to whom and what is done the sampling and who's done the deciding, as well as the time frame of this whole thing. This may last much longer in terms of observations may be going on for months or years, whereas the research cruise may only go on for like 60 days maximum. So again, there's a lot of things to be thought about here as to how that might work. So these are the kind of things I've asked my friends what they think about this, and basically the whole treaty. This came from a UK research cruise, which was going on at the time that the treaty was being discussed at the last session, and I was communicating at the same time. And the research scientist just said all the reporting requirements are sensible and good. 80% of these things most cruises try to do anyway. 20% we don't, but should. It's really a hugely positive step to see these aspirations written down and agreed upon. And he says again, the reality at the bottom of the sea is somewhat different, of course. The volume of data and information is immense. And the thing that I keep saying, this list of cruises and BBNJ with ship, rough location, chief scientist dates is hugely useful and actually a massive undertaking on its own. Again, it's a very positive outlook on why this might benefit science. And then at the bottom it says, it would take resources to do this. At the moment, oceanographic agencies struggle to cope with the volume of data, even with the small number of ships. At the moment, the data collected to date will not meet the BBNJ requirements fully. So again, as a community, we need to decide how to deal with this amount of data and the quality and the minimal data standards, etc. And of course, a major issue is that many projects don't have funding beyond the cruise, a couple of years beyond it, and it may make this longer term reporting much more difficult. So what are the positives for science in the treaty? It's consistent with the definitions for terrestrial benefit sharing as well through Nagoya. This notification before the cruise, I think, is incredibly positive in terms of coordination of global science research on the oceans. There's this obligation to deposit data and samples and to make them available. I think that, again, that's really positive. And again, it means that you know that these things came from the deep sea. Again, often that data is missing when you go further down the pipeline of data manipulation, data analysis. There's reporting on the use of samples and data. This inclusion of DSI, digital sequence information, an agreement to work together on DSI. So between the different bodies that are dealing with this, BBNJ, the Conventional Biological Diversity, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization are all working on DSI and benefit sharing. We're trying to do something above that level right now. There was a monumental decision in the late 2022 by the CBD to try and work this out between the different UN bodies. Benefits pays at the moment, benefits are based on payments into funds, assessed contributions to start with, but maybe later on actually calculated based on the benefits derived from deep sea products. Yeah, and this thing, the direct link between the benefits and what they're to be used for, which has not been in any previous treaty as far as I know, certainly not on the Nagoya Protocol. And the benefit sharing committee will be set up, and scientists should be involved in that. Again, that's defined in the treaty itself. So let's see what happens next. So as we already heard, 90 countries signed so far, 5 ratified, and we're hoping that the whole thing will be done, as Christina optimistically says, by next summer. I really hope that it will be true. I know the EU will be ratifying very soon, I hope. Okay, so what can you do at this point in time? And again, if you look at the BBNJ treaty bodies, Christina already mentioned all of these, the important part is that at 2 points, the relevant legal instruments can give advice into the scientific and technical body, and it can be scientists and experts. It could be you guys here involved in advising to the scientific and technical body or being on the scientific and technical body. On the other side, stakeholders, again, are providing information directly into the convention, conference of the parties. And again, this is an opportunity to get involved through DOSI or otherwise into providing information straight into the COP. And I think that's really, really critical. And of course, there's these other committees on capacity building and transfer of marine technology and access and benefit sharing, all of which may require scientific input. So I'm going to provide these slides to Brandon to disseminate. But again, there's a bunch of links here as well to read about, including what I would say, this fantastic article by Jeff, linking straight into the next presentation. This really fun article to read about what it was really like to be there on the last night. Okay, and just thank you for listening, and just saying this is all part of a big European project called Blue Remediomics, and you can see who the partners are and who paid the money. And again, yeah, a lot of these slides are prepared with their support. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcel, for the presentation and for guiding us into the next presentation from Jeff. Just by way of introduction, Professor Jeffrey J. Marlowe is a professor of biology at Boston University and also co-leads DOSI's BBNJ working group. So he's going to share his thoughts and insights on deep ocean science and policy related to this topic.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the introduction and everyone else for being here. And of course to Christina and Marcel for setting this up so nicely. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. And here we go. All right, so most of my actual work involves deep sea science. Getting into the more policy relevant components of this through BBNJ was definitely a learning curve for me. So most of my research takes place at methane seeps and hydrothermal vents down on the seafloor. And you know, my first few times in these BBNJ negotiations were really about learning an entirely new language and an entirely new process. And it occurred to me that in many ways it was similar to kind of deep sea research cruises that we go on. So the first point of similarity I realized was, you know, you're sitting in this room and you are trying to pay attention to what's happening. There are different languages sort of coming through your earpiece. And to me, you know, any given moment was not necessarily the most exciting thing. But if you looked up after 10 minutes, you were at a completely different point. And that reminded me a lot of these research cruises we go on where, you know, we can see things happening in front of us and over the timescale of seconds, like not much is changing. It can be a little bit boring as you're watching the seafloor go in front of you, but come back in 10 minutes and you're at an entirely new part of the seafloor. The other thing I realized was that much of the work is really happening outside of these large sessions where people are talking to each other more candidly, calling whatever collaborators or other team members they need to get expertise. And in the same way that our research cruises are really just based on the fact that so much work has gone into things before the actual moment of discovery. It's really based on a huge foundation of collaboration, technical expertise, and bringing all of that together into a certain point of view. And then the final bit was that, this was sort of a scene from that final night as things were emerging to finally come together. There is kind of a component of serendipity and, confluence of all of this as well, that if you happen to be on the seafloor at the right spot, you'll find something amazing. And in the same case here, out in the lobby of the hallways, long after hours, things finally got done. So my hope today is to briefly talk about what this text means for scientists specifically. And we've heard a lot about what the sort of 4 pillars of this treaty actually were. They're listed here again. And then we've also heard from Marcel specifically on the marine genetic resources, and a really nice deep dive into that. So I'm gonna not spend as much time on that, but I've divided this kind of into 3 categories that made sense to me. I would love to hear from everyone else as we start discussing, but to me, there's kind of things that are requirements that researchers are now legally, assuming this gets ratified, legally required to do. There's also a bunch of recommendations, things that, would be great to support the overall goals of the treaty, but are not explicit requirements, perhaps. And then I'm also excited about this huge range of opportunities that the endeavors of research can really support. So what we're studying, how we're studying it, how we're getting information to the policymakers. There's now kind of a whole new realm, I think, of policy relevant research that we can start to focus on in the coming years. So I've taken screenshots of the actual text. I just find it really fun and interesting to look at the actual language. We're not going to read through all of these, but I just wanted to highlight kind of a few of these things that are now associated with the treaty that scientists will be most affected by. Marcel talked about this, so I'm not going to belabor it. It's the idea of the pre-cruise report. Before you go out, we need to know where people are going, what they're doing. Most of this is pretty standard already. Then there's the post-cruise report, which is, again, summarizing what you've already done and specifically explaining where these now sort of common resources or genetic information can be found. So there's a repository that you would need to clarify for digital sequence information. And then there's also the repository for physical samples where these marine genetic resources will be housed. The next sort of set of requirements, once you're back from the cruise and have kind of described what you've done and where all the samples are, is to think about, I mean, this should be happening throughout the entire process, but the non-monetary benefit sharing. So this is the opportunity for scientists specifically, I think, to get really involved in terms of how, the benefits and aspects of marine scientific research are being shared and distributed. This can be a range of things from access to samples, access to the digital sequence information, a bunch of capacity building opportunities that I'll talk a little bit more about, cooperation. So this is there throughout the text, there are long lists of things that are relevant that you could kind of pick from, but very few of them are specifically required. You got to do something on this list, but it's kind of up to you to figure out what's most relevant. Submitting the genetic resources and digital sequence information within 3 years is written into the text, as is a report from the parties. So these are the the entities and states that have signed on to describe what's happened with all of these MGR from the areas beyond national jurisdiction. So this is more of a requirement of, again, the signatories, but obviously it's the researchers actually doing this. So I would envision a world in which you get, you need to kind of report on this based on your crews, and the state parties would kind of compile all of this information from research happening under their jurisdiction to then submit it up to the clearinghouse mechanism. So keeping track of all of the things that are happening with where the samples are going through that batch identifier will certainly be something we should all be doing. This is another thing that's really a requirement at the party level, the capacity building. And there's a lot of flexibility for how scientists specifically can address it. Again, there are a lot of good ideas in the text, but it's really, kind of should be a case-by-case basis in terms of where you're going, what sort of science you're doing, and how to match that with specific needs from developing parties. So this is a little bit more depth on how that transfer of marine technology and how the capacity building could happen. I was struck by kind of two aspects of this. One is that there's a big emphasis on the usability of this. So that's written into this, that the capacity building and transfer of marine technology should not, involve onerous reporting requirements, and should be usable. And then there's the second aspect that it should be responsive to specific needs. So just like handing off a piece of equipment you're not using anymore when no one has specifically requested this and it's not that usable, would not really qualify as functional capacity building or transfer of technology. Here's a little bit of that list of various things that this could entail. We won't go through all of it, but it can be anything from actual samples being exchanged to protocols and workshops to infrastructure. So again, there's a huge range of things depending on what's most relevant and needed. Now we're shifting to a different sort of pillar of the text, which is about area-based management tools and marine protected areas. And this is, I think, one of the biggest and most exciting opportunities for conservationists and scientists, which is there's now a mechanism to propose an MPA. There's, again, another long list of things that this could be based on. These include things like it's a unique setting. It has a special importance because there's a specific species that is an endemic to this environment, or it's really on the front lines of climate change. So whatever the reason, if it's justified, it could kind of enter into this path toward becoming an MPA. There are a few sites that have already kind of been brought forward by NGOs and scientists. So I was excited by a few of these that I thought I'd highlight. One is the Walvis Ridge, this really interesting tectonic environment off the coast of Southwest Africa, Namibia, where there's this weird like plate situation, creating a lot of interesting chemosynthetic environments and sort of bolstering fisheries. There's the Salas y Gomez and Nazca Ridges, which is just this like highway of seamounts, all kinds of really cool life there. Because it gets so close to the surface, there's actually some corals that are on these seamounts, and again, really nice opportunities for biodiversity studies. And it's specifically kind of threatened from a few different potential directions, from fishing, climate change, and maybe mining. So that's another great reason to propose MPAs, is if they're specifically under threat. The Sargasso Sea has had a lot of work done on it as well. There's this kind of floating patch of the sargassum out in the Western Atlantic Ocean, and it's a refuge for little critters like these seahorses and a nursery for sea turtles. There's the Costa Rica Thermal Dome. This is a spot where cold water kind of upwells from the depths of the ocean to bring nutrients and fuel all these larger megafauna. And then finally, my favorite one, of course, is the Lost City Hydrothermal Vent. This is a really geologically bizarre kind of one-off environment in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that has really interesting implications for the origin of life. This is where some people think might be the most likely place where kind of chemistry turned into biology. So there's your whirlwind tour of a few potential MPAs, but these are just the handful that some people have been pushing already, but now there's a way to kind of get more of these going. So if you find that you're really passionate about a particular spot that could be an MPA, there's now a way to kind of do that. And there's a lot of opportunity for scientific input for assessing these proposals, not just submitting them, but assessing them as well. One of them is kind of the idea of an emergency measure for MPAs. So if there's like a specific time-bound condition where there's like a new threat coming up, where we need to really rapidly and maybe temporarily protect parts of the high seas, there's a possibility for that. And I could imagine, scientists in particular are really well suited to see where those threats could be coming from. For example, if we know it's going to be a big El Nino year, maybe that causes a specific threat for a certain part of the ocean that could be sort of fast-tracked for protection. Another of these 4 pillars is about the environmental impact assessments. Those certainly require a lot of scientific input. There is kind of going to be this roster of experts created under the scientific and technical body to conduct or assess these screenings and impact assessments. And one of the phrases that is in a lot of these articles is figuring out like which states are kind of most affected or could be most affected. And this again depends on a pretty good knowledge of how the ocean works, and specifically kind of trans-boundary issues. Not all species just stay in one place, and neither does the water. It is constantly moving around through ocean currents. So trying to see how maybe a plume from a industrial activity could be moved through the ocean and might affect some states more than others. And then there's a clearinghouse mechanism. This is sort of remains to be determined, but scientists certainly have a lot of experience with uploading things, as Marcel really nicely showed, and trying to trace it through its scientific and industrial lifespan. So I think this is a great opportunity for researchers to contribute and make this as painless as possible. And then finally, there is a provision for sort of funding some of this work specifically for developing states parties, capacity building projects, or actual research and ways to best implement it that will hopefully be available through this trust fund that specifically, kind of builds the capacity and allows everyone to contribute. All right, so that is what I had, and I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts as we start to discuss. But that is my sense, at least, of a few of the highlights, not exhaustive highlights, of how scientists will kind of be most affected and can then, in turn, affect this new treaty. Thanks very much.
Hello, recording viewers. Thank you for watching these presentations on how ocean scientists can engage with the BBNJ treaty. If you're interested in carrying this work further, DOSI has expert working groups that focus on bridging science policy gaps on the topics of both BBNJ and marine genetic resources. Those groups are linked in the description below, so I hope you'll take a look. Either way, thank you again for watching, and thank you to the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy for hosting these talks at the DOOS annual meeting. We're looking forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.